Thank you. Amazing to be at the RI to speak in this kind of such historic venue. And of course, a big thank you both to the RI and to Martingale that have made this event possible. I also want to give a big plug to Martingale because I think that investing so much in training the next generation of academics, I think, is hugely important in kind of maths and statistics. So yes, I'm going to talk about data. And about whether they deceive or inform. And I think it's become particularly pertinent with the rise of large language models and ChatGPT, which I think we all probably now use ubiquitously, I would say. I do want to give a little bit of a plug for LSE, but I miss Imperial hugely. I was at Imperial for most of my career, but LSE is a really interesting place because for the first time really in my academic career, I'm working at a place that it has social science, so I now chat to philosophers and anthropologists and sociologists, and that's been really enlightening for me and made me realize actually that I was in quite a narrow way of thinking, and it's really broadened how I now think about things, and I think that will inform some of the talk today. And in fact, their motto is to know the causes of things, which is something I was trying to do when I was at Imperial. I get less time to do it now because I tend to spend a lot of time thinking about education. LSE is very political, so current world events are taking up quite a lot of my time. I do want to talk a little bit about my career trajectory, particularly for the scholars in the room, because I think an academic career is a joy and also a challenge. So I want to talk about some of those challenges. Then I want to talk about data influence and spend a bit of time thinking about dark data and the amount of data that we're collecting and the implications that has. Then I want to come on to causality, which I think is something we think about all the time. We're always asking causal questions. We're always trying to answer questions about making decisions and so on. And that's actually very tricky to do with data effectively. Then I'll talk about counterfactual reasoning, some of the approaches that I've been working on and are being worked on at the moment in the field, and then just some conclusions. So my career, I did an MSc. I guess the big jump for me into statistics from mathematics was an MSc in computational statistics. And that wasn't even where I saw my career going. I loved maths, loved doing maths. A professor of statistics, Bernard Silverman, he then went on to become one of the CSAs, actually. He was a professor of statistics at Bath, and he convinced me to stay on and do the MSc, and it was a big change for me and actually made me realize, I guess set me off on my career trajectory. Then I did a PhD in statistics at Imperial, finishing in 1994, so a long time ago, and then started my career there as a lecturer initially in 1996, and I know that there are Imperial representatives here today, so I spent a big chunk of my time at Imperial, and I think I probably have Imperial in my DNA. Although now some of that is being kind of infected with LSE DNA as well, which is a good thing. Influences in my career were obviously my PhD supervisor, Andrew Alden, but also Adrian Smith, who is the president of the Royal Society, another great institution here in London. I don't know if anyone's noticed anything about the people that have had these big academic influences on me, anything that you notice about them? About the three, maybe you can judge it by the names, maybe not. So they're all men, yet, which I think is also something that I'm trying to think about and influence, trying to get more women and more mix, I think, into these kind of scientific and mathematical careers. I did a very brief postdoc, did a couple of years at NYU in the States, and then I came back to Imperial. And now I'm at LSE. But I want to move on to what I'm going to talk about today, and that's data influence. And I think it's becoming more and more important because we're collecting more and more data, and people are making decisions based on this data that we collect. But the question is this data useful? We seem to store data. We store a lot of data, much of which we don't use, much of which really doesn't answer the kind of questions that we might want to answer, and then how do you actually extract the signal from the noise in that data? I think something that we're not really thinking about enough is the environmental impact of the data that we use. We're predicted apparently to reach 170 zettabytes of data. Well, this is unimaginable amounts of data by 2025. And if we're using cloud-based, if we're using ChatGPT, that involves transferring data. And this doesn't look like a huge amount. To transfer 1 gig costs around 3 to 7 kilowatt hours. Seems quite small compared to, a kettle, for example. But indeed, think about the amounts of data we're now transferring. That really adds up. Training an AI model emits over 300 tons of CO2, and we seem to be obsessed with training AI models at the moment. And of course, as I've said, a lot of this data is actually dark. So I think probably a lot of the data that I have, I will never use again. It just sits probably on this Mac, but in lots of other places as well. Probably a lot of my data is still sitting at Imperial, and I'm generating more at LSE. And then there's also data that these two, there's a bit of overlap here, but not necessarily. We also have a lot of data that we collect that's completely redundant or obsolete or just trivial and isn't ever going to be used to answer questions of importance. I was at a talk just on Thursday evening where Dr. Jennifer Prentke, who's the head of AI data at Google DeepMind, was talking about the need for us to move from big data to kind of great data, so data that actually is useful and collected and used with purpose. And she also talked about the need to move from these large language models, which are now being trained on just unimaginable data sets, to thinking about more context-specific kind of small language models. So I think that hopefully we're going to see a bit of a shift in some of the uses of data so that we really think about their use. At the talk, Jennifer also talked about her journey with data. Actually, no, I think she was talking about a data scientist that works at Tesla, and he was talking about how he'd moved from theory to working with data. And I think the same thing has really happened with my career. So this is me going from my undergrad, where when I was an undergrad, it was pretty theoretical. I almost never touched data. And I actually did a very interesting, supposedly applied statistics course in my third year as an undergrad, but even that didn't really use any data. So I had a small amount of data, but mainly theory. Slightly better on my master's, used a bit more data, but still mainly theory. Then I kind of regressed a bit when I did my PhD, which was mainly theoretical. I say regress because I know that we have lots of pure mathematicians in the room here. And I'm talking about my personal regression here. And then when I was doing my postdoc, I had to actually answer some questions that concerned data. So I kind of dirtied my hands a little bit with data. But now, interestingly, I spend all my time trying to get good data to answer the questions that I want to answer. And that is the challenge, because we don't really have systems of well-connected data yet. I think we've made good progress, certainly in the UK. The government statistics, lots of good data and statistics being done, but we're way away from being in a situation where we can really answer some of these questions. So now in fact, most of my time now I spend thinking about wider education issues, but when I am thinking about maths and statistics, I'm now thinking about data much more. And I think that I can see that kind of changing as the data that we collect progresses. For me, I've always been very, very empirical and very data-centered. I am just obsessed about data. I use data to answer pretty much every question that I have. I go and research and look at data. I have a particular interest in transport, which sounds a bit bizarre. Why did I start getting interested in transport? And it was purely selfish. I started cycling to Imperial from where I live in Camden. And it was completely terrifying to me because there'd been a lot of cycling deaths. There'd been a lot of bad press about cycling in London. So then I discovered one of my closest collaborators, Dan Graham, who's in civil engineering at Imperial, and he runs the Transport Studies Centre there. And he'd done an awful lot of work on accidents, and we started working together. So I was really just finding how I could effectively get from my home in North London to Imperial without dying was how I basically started my journey into real data, and now we've published together quite extensively. Then I started stressing about the air quality in London, started working with Audrey de Nazel, who's in the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial, so did quite a lot of work in how do I not only cycle without getting killed, well, in the short term, you know, how do I now cycle without getting killed in the long term by getting poisoned by the air pollution that we have in London? So I spent a lot of time working on those things. Makes me sound very selfish. There you go. And lots of collaborators, and I think the one thing that I would impress upon all of you really, for those of you that are scholars, and this is true, even maths can be quite isolating, I think, when you're working on your PhD. And I think the more that we think about working as kind of in groups and as together to solve these problems, the size of the problems we're facing now, I think require this kind of much broader range of scientists and not just scientists, social scientists and humanities, and a broad range of academics working on these problems. So one of the big issues that I have when I'm trying to answer some of these questions is that I'm mainly working on observational data. It's very hard for me to design an experiment where I can say, okay, I'm going to figure out if this junction is really dangerous. I'm going to force people to cycle through it just to see if they are more likely to die there than elsewhere. So as much as I'd love to do that kind of experiment, right, in terms of answering those scientific questions. So you run into these ethical issues in that I'm basically left with observational data. I'm left with data that isn't designed. But there's lots and lots of data, lots of interesting data. I've been involved in analyzing data from the Boris spikes, as were, from the London Underground data, lots of data from kind of postcode impact data where they're looking at major roadworks and so on. Strava data. Anyone here use Strava? Any exercise people? Yes, okay. So I'm obsessed with my Strava data. And at one point, now there are all these privacy things, quite rightly, of course. So there was a point when you could access, they were quite generous with their data sets. So there was some very interesting data that you could analyze. And then I think they realized that it's kind of hard to anonymize some of this data. Same is true of the London Underground data. At a point, we were working with quite a lot of the Underground data. But I kind of figured, I was trying to think about whether I could identify myself from what was the Oyster cards were, remember Oyster cards? Now no one has them really. But Oyster cards were great because then you could literally, you knew exactly, you could tag them to a particular person. So you had these lovely longitudinal data sets. And then I remember thinking, I wonder if I could identify myself just from the traits. And of course, you can because of the patterns in the data. So now they're also more careful with their data. So we have these issues of trying to answer these big questions and then also trying to make sure that we keep people's data safe is also an issue. Stats 19, however, is still published, and this is an amazing data set. It makes me sound like I'm obsessed with accidents and deaths, which I am. Stats 19 publishes. This is the police. Every accident that is reported to the police goes into Stats 19. It's an incredibly rich data set that gives us a lot of information. And then a couple of weeks ago, tragically, a cyclist, one of our PhD students at LSE, was killed in a cycling accident in London. And it made me think, I need to go back to actually publishing some of these things because she was killed at a junction that I would never, ever cycle through. And so I think people aren't aware when they're cycling of where these are. And I think that if, again, because people aren't necessarily as data obsessed as I am, so they don't go and do that initial research to find out where is it safe to cycle, or where are you less likely. Anyway, of course, I can never account for the kind of crazy driver or the crazy other cyclist. But I think my route into work is probably, I cycle about at the moment, it's much quicker for me to get into work now I'm at LSE, but I still cycle about 1 kilometre further than I need to because I have to avoid some of these death spots. The pasta data is really interesting as well. This was some work that I did with Audrey de Nazel at Empirical. And that was, I think this is one of those cases where you think of the acronym and then you obviously try to fit the words around it. So this is the physical activity through sustainable transport approaches. Yeah, there's the last A. But it's an amazing data set where we have had a whole load of volunteers, 100 in a bunch of European cities, wearing sense-wear that they then collected. So we had a really rich data set of how they traveled, plus a whole load of other covariates so that we could kind of analyze that data set. Very nice. Which comes to the issue with all of this data, if we're trying to actually address some of these questions. So for me, it's how do I get into work safely? How do you do that when you have this data to work with? Is it representative? So this is from 2015, at a point where there'd been quite a few cycling deaths, and there was a lot of newspaper stories about it. And there was this headline, cycling deaths, why are you 17 times likelier to be killed on a bike than in a car? And it made me think, well, is that actually true? And they just reported it from the basic stats that were published from Stats 19. And so the question really is, when can these statistical statements be trusted, given that they're based on this data that's just observational? So does anyone have any idea, anyone that's seen me speak about this before might have seen this, does anyone have any idea what that is? It is London, yes. So it's made of points. Anybody? Accidents. There you go. Good guess. Yes. That is. So these are the things that I like producing, because then I actually I haven't updated it for a while, not for a couple of years, I must. But I used to update my kind of accident map of London. So this is just a dot for every single road traffic accident reported to the police between 2001 and 2007. I definitely need to get the newer map. But you can see the Thames. There are some road traffic accidents apparently in the middle of the Thames, actually, if you look at quite carefully, which again speaks to some of the issues that I was talking about in terms of we need to work with good data. And in fact, this is a fantastic data set. I could say generally it's really accurate. You get a few in Hyde Park, road traffic accidents in Hyde Park, but of course they report accident deaths. I can tell you for a fact that you can see that there are a couple of dots in Hyde Park. And another thing that, you can see a couple of dots here. These are cycling accidents. I went to have a look at them. So these cyclists are cycling illegally, because the only place you could actually cycle, but I'm a bit of an evangelist of not jumping lights and always cycling where I should. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that data actually later on. Now this is the Strava cycle heat map. This is kind of interesting because so first of all I thought, I'm actually on this data set because I cycle, and I was thinking I cycle from North London up here. I used to cycle, I don't anymore, now I cycle straight down to LSE, but I used to cycle around Regent's Park, across here, and then to Imperial down here. But then I realized, actually, I'm not on this map because I used to have a Garmin that it was too much faff to change between running and cycling. So when I was cycling in, I'd use my Garmin. Anyone has a Garmin, these wonderful sports watches? If I haven't measured something, I haven't done it, basically, right? So, tragic. But I used to measure all of my bike rides, but I'd leave it on run mode because I couldn't be bothered. So in fact, I wasn't cycling. I was just running super fast around kind of like that. And actually not even that fast. You know, at a point when it used to be kind of public, I'd get these messages saying, do you want a training partner? And then I'd have to admit the fact I wasn't running quickly. I was just cycling slowly. But again, I would have been on the running version of this map completely incorrectly, not corrected by Strava, because I cycle slowly enough that it might be kind of credible that I was actually running. So again, this is another picture of the bike accidents just from 2015. It's fairly horrendous, and in fact, so there are these places that I really avoid, where you get lots of accidents, and you could see them from the actual kind of density map that I showed earlier. There are real places which are just dangerous to cycle in London, and you should avoid like the plague if you're on a bike. We did have, so Dan Graham, who I collaborated with at Empirical, he'd done quite a lot of work on speed cameras as well before. So he was interested in do they actually reduce road traffic accidents? So, for example, that this is a causal question. How can we use data to answer that question? And I'll come on to why that's a difficult thing to do just from the data later on. But really, the motivation for me is causal questions. So I'm at LSE now, where causality is the thing that we think about all the time, and I kind of love that, understanding the causes of things. So we have all of these questions. How can we harness the huge data that we collect to answer them? And there are just a few of the things that I've worked on in the past: speed cameras, road network capacity expansions. We became quite interested. Actually, this was one of those things where you're looking at data and you see a particular effect. And then, so we noticed that where we were seeing lots of child pedestrian accidents were in the parts of London that are not quite as wealthy. So I used to work in South Kensington, very few child pedestrian accidents in South London compared to where I am now in kind of Holloway. And so we have questions about what is the impact of that. Is it just about how roads are designed and so on? What is it that's going on with that data? So this is the kind of thing that I work on. I do want to give a potted history to causal inference, because then again it comes back to the fact that I should have done my looking for the women in the past that have also worked on causal inference, because of course this is another list of great male academics. Jerzy Neyman, a great statistician, was really the first person that thought about this kind of framework for causality, even though it wasn't seen as such, and that was in 1923, where he really described what I'm going to talk about later on, which is the idea of potential outcomes. And then Austin Bradford Hill, many of you may have heard of, he was the one that really published a paper that had the first randomized control trial, so where you're really thinking about your experiment. And then, of course, Ronald Fisher, brilliant statistician, apparently less pleasant as a person. He had a massive, he and Neyman never really got on. There was a big conflict there. So he published a lot on the design of experiments, including a seminal book in 1951. And then the amazing Don Rubin, who's still alive, who developed the whole framework that we use now, or I use for causal inference, and there are actually others. So I want to give another example because it illustrates why data can sometimes deceive. And this is one that kind of emanates from COVID, when we were all, it feels like such a long time ago now, doesn't it? It feels like, wow, did that actually happen? But this is data from Test and Trace. And we, at Empirical, large numbers of people were working on this problem. We had both in the kind of maths department and obviously in medicine with our epidemiologists. So Test and Trace, and in fact, we also did Test and Trace at Empirical as well. So we had testing centers, as did other universities. But Test and Trace ran from May 2020 to February 2022. And the idea there was that we were trying to do the contact tracing. So you'd find out from somebody that tested positive all the people they'd had contact with, and then they would try to contact those as a way of trying to contain the spread of COVID. The data for the Test and Trace Test and Trace data in terms of how many contacts had been identified and how many of them had actually been successfully contacted were published weekly. And everybody was pretty hawkish with the data, certainly I was at the time. And there was a drop in the contact of identified close contacts. So there was a bit of a drop in terms of how many people they'd successfully contacted from a week in October 2020 to the next week. And then people were asking questions about, well, does that actually mean that Test and Trace then was becoming less effective? We were clearly contacting less people than had been identified. But what did that actually tell us about the process of Test and Trace? The issue, of course, is that they were 2 different weeks, so they're 2 different populations that are being talked about, with different properties, potentially. So this is where I'm going to try and introduce the idea of potential outcomes. So here's the data. There were, in the first week, in October, there were 286,846 people that they were trying to contact, that had been named as people that had been a close contact of someone with COVID, but of course they couldn't contact them all. So and then the next week, which was a different population of people that we were trying to make the contacts for, there were 327,000 or so. So what I've got here is I've made my treatment the week that you're in. So if you're in that first week, D is going to be 0. In the second week, you're going to be D is 1. And we're trying to compare these two populations, right? So this Y here is whether they were actually successfully contacted. And you can see that some of them were, but some of them weren't. So there are some zeros where a named contact wasn't actually successfully contacted. But of course, we've only observed that for that particular week, in week 0. And we have no idea what would happen if that person was attempted to be contacted in the second week. And it's a bit like, imagine I have a headache, and I take a paracetamol to try and cure my headache, or a Nurofen, or whatever it is your preferred medicine is. And then 20 minutes later, my headache has gone. Is that actually the paracetamol, or had I had a drink of water, would it have gone? Anyway, what I really want to do is I want to wind the clock back 20 minutes and then not take the paracetamol and see if my headache has gone. But of course, I don't observe that. So we're in this weird situation where half of our data set is missing in terms of trying to, if I could measure these things that I haven't measured, this is if you like, these are both potential outcomes. They're the potential outcomes from the experiment, but I only measure one of them. If I could measure them both, then causal inference would just be a matter of arithmetic. It wouldn't be any harder than that. So I've got all this missing data. So the counterfactuals are the things that I don't measure. So the counterfactuals, I've got all these missing ones here, and then in the second week, the counterfactuals, because I didn't measure that data in the first week. And what I want to do is I want to measure my treatment effect. So I want to work out the expected value of Y1 minus Y0. So is there a difference between week 2 and week 1? I've labeled them 0 and 1 just to confuse you, right? The reason I've done that is for a reason, because usually we're having a treatment effect. So if you're treated, you get a 1, and if you're not treated, you get a 0. Okay, and as I've said, the problem is for each person, we only either have Y0 or Y1. We only have the thing that was measured and observed, not the counterfactual. So here are the actual numbers. And this is actual published data. You can look this up, right? So we have a total of 286,000 over 286,000 in week 1 and 327,000 in the next week. And these are the numbers that were actually contacted. These are the percentages. Pretty high, right? We were doing quite well then in terms of contacting the close contacts. But it looks as if there's a small drop. So if you were just going to forget about the fact that we didn't have the counterfactuals, we're just going to assume that population in week 1 is the same as population in week 2, and look at the raw differences, we get a drop in 0.7% in terms of the percentages being contacted. But there may be some, I think, assuming my arithmetic is right there, you can kind of correct me if it's not. The major issue we have with making any conclusions about that data is that there's potential confounding. And confounding is really the bane of my existence, I have to say, in terms of making any conclusions about observational data. Because it's when a measured outcome is affected by something else, often unmeasured, by some other factor. And this is I'm sure that many of you that have done causal inference, actually, I wasn't taught any causal inference in my undergrad or my master's, and I think that that's a bit of a travesty. So for those of you that have done maths degrees here, stick your hand up if you were taught causal inference formally. Hey, a few. Perfect, but that's tiny. That's a very small percentage. Of course, this is only us in the room, right? I'm not making any causal statements about that being mapping to the population. But I think that it's something that should just be required. Econ, it's done. It is a matter of course, which is kind of quite interesting. But this confounding is a really important cause of spurious correlations in data. So here's an example, a nice simple example. Having a cigarette lighter in your pocket gives you lung cancer. So, easy one to start with. What's the confounding variable here? What is it that's causing the cancer? Smoking, yes. Here's another one. Having bigger feet makes you a better reader. Any idea? Do you know if you've got bigger feet, you're much better at reading? Age, yes. So of course, babies, we have a little one in the audience somewhere. Probably not a brilliant reader, but lovely little feet. So here you go. This is a published study. Did you know this is actually published? So you can look this up. The more chocolate you eat, you're much more likely to win a Nobel Prize. Here we go. Here's Switzerland up here. Lots of chocolate being eaten, lots of Nobel Prizes being awarded. And so look at this. You've got an R value here, so 0.791. Very correlated. Significant correlation here. More chocolate, more likely you are to win a Nobel Prize. Any idea what's going on here? Yeah, the economy, richer, more education, who knows? Maybe it is just chocolate. In this paper, it does talk about, I'm going with it. I'm a big fan of chocolate. So we have these confounders, and the problem is, I think, unless you really have an understanding of this, it's really easy. And in fact, most of statistics, as is taught, is really about models of correlation. It's not if you look at machine learning tools, a lot of them are being trained on data. They're effectively just looking at patterns, incredible predictions based on the patterns in the current data that you have. How do we know that they've measured all of the confounders that might be impacting things? So let's dig into the COVID data in a bit more detail. And you'll see, if you split the data by whether it's collected by health protection teams, for which most of the data was, or those outside the HPTs. Places like Empirical, there were lots of places in the first week that were collecting, also doing test and tracing. They were doing amazingly well. Look at this. So 97% or so of those places like Empirical were able to contact all of the close contacts, whereas out in the general population with the health protection teams, they were less. Now, there was a drop. If you can look at what happens. So if you split the data between HPTs and not HPTs, they both show an increase. Okay, so how is that possible? This is basically saying if your data is collected by an HPT, we're seeing an increase. If your data is not collected by an HPT, you're also seeing an increase. But when you aggregate the data, there's a drop. Anyone know what the name of this paradox is? Anyone that did first years? Simpsons. Anyone that did first year? Anyone who I taught first year maths at Empirical will know this. So yeah, this is an example of Simpson's paradox. And the issue here is the fact that there's this drop in the data that was collected by non-HPTs. So you suddenly get an imbalance between those two groups that mean that it looks like a big contradiction, but of course it isn't, because in the non-HPT groups, they're collected with such high percentages. So when you mix the data together, if you get a change in that group, then you get something going in completely a different direction. So in this case, the health protection team is a confounder, and you're not getting the right answer effectively because you haven't accounted for that. Although it depends. It does depend. Because sometimes we're interested in a causal impact within a treated group. So it may be, I don't work for a place that actually does contact tracing. So for me, I'm more interested in what happens in that HPT group, for example. So you might just be interested in whether you're treated or not. So I think we have to think very carefully about these things before we make any of, think about our assumptions. So another thing that I spend a lot of time doing, it's kind of really interesting. My brain is atrophying slightly now that that sounds terrible, doesn't it? But I don't, it's interesting in different ways. So maths is one of those things that you just have to do all the time. There was a point when I was researching really intensely, and I swear I used to dream about directed acyclical graphs. I haven't had a dream about a DAG for a little while, but I still think about them. Whenever I'm asked a causal question, I start thinking about my graphs. So anyone that does... So when you're doing causal inference, the first thing that you should do is think about what are your variables, what has an impact, what are you trying to measure. So if you're trying to look at accident rate, for example, what might have an impact? This is only a partial DAG for this, but it may be that traffic volume will have an impact, more traffic, more accidents. The speed limit may have an influence. Speed cameras may have an influence, and you've got these arrows going to show the direction of the causal link. And there used to be something called Operation Safeway that they used to just they'll have a particular intervention that's aimed at reducing the accident rate. So there are all these things. If you're thinking about the speed camera example, it's quite an interesting one because they only put speed cameras into places where you have lots of accidents in the first place. So there are all these things that you have to untangle before you can really get to grips with what's happening for the analysis. So I was talking about Don Rubin and this amazing framework that he built for causal inference. It kind of still blows my mind. I think it's quite clever. So I talked about the fact that we have these. Let's just think about the simple case where you're either treated or you're not. So here, my variable for being treated is D, and you get a 1 if you're treated and a 0 if you're not, so if you're the control. And then you have a sample of subjects and this treatment, and now you have the two potential outcomes, a bit like that COVID example. The outcome if you are treated and the outcome if you're not treated. And of course, you only observe one of those, as I've said, but we'd like to observe them both, which is just impossible. So the variable for the outcome that's observed, you can just calculate, because in this case, D is either 0 or 1, so you can just write that as that formula, because D is the indicator variable for treatment. And the unobserved outcome is your counterfactual, the thing that you don't measure. So then we have all of this population level effects, the expected value of Y0 and Y1, remembering, of course, that you don't have all of this data. There's loads of missing data. And your treatment effect is just the expected value of the difference of those things, the outcome if you're treated and the outcome if you're not treated. And that's problematic, right, given that we don't have half of the data in this experiment. We might also be interested in, as I've already explained, you might also be interested in the treatment effect just for the treated. So that's a conditional expectation, given that the treatment status is 1. And you might be interested in either of those. So it was seen for a long time as a completely kind of unsolvable problem, until the advent of randomized control trials, which actually have not been around for all that long, and they're still the gold standard for estimating treatment effect. And what they do is they ensure that treatment status isn't confounded with measured or unmeasured characteristics, because you randomize your treatment across the population, and then you assume that all of the characteristics are going to be not unfairly looked at. So you deal with your confounding. And in that case, you can measure your treatment effects directly. Now, of course, as I've already said, a lot of the analysis tools are really designed to study association and not causation. So a lot of the causal inference methods, people are still very skeptical, statisticians as well. They're kind of like, basically, you can't measure this. And in fact, somebody who strongly believed you couldn't measure these things was this guy here. And I've mentioned him already. This is Fisher. You'll see that he's smoking. That's why I like this picture. He smoked a lot. He was convinced there was not a correlation between smoking and cancer. Adamant. He was absolutely adamant about it. He had a lot of funding from tobacco companies, which might have had something to do with him. He was absolutely convinced that this was just due to some other unmeasured confounder. And then it took a long time before we proved that, of course, smoking is not a good thing to do. Interestingly, here's a little anecdote. I was interviewing once when I was at Empirical in the medical school for a statistician, for an epidemiologist. And one of the other professors on the panel, his question we had one of the interview candidates did a lot of work in kind of cancer studies. It's amazing work. And then the interviewer said to him, this professor, his question was, I used to absolutely love smoking, and I gave up because I know it's bad for me. And then he said, but I really don't want to get dementia. And he said to this poor candidate, when should I start smoking again to guarantee that I will die before I get Alzheimer's? And I've been thinking more recently as I get older and reflect, again, as my brain atrophies, thinking, what vice should I re-pick up to make sure that anyway. But in all of this, of course, these studies that we do are really important. And you can't really do control, can't do randomized control trials again with smoking. So we have to do that by outcome regression kind of models that I'll come on to in a little while. Oh, wow, I'm running out of time. So observational studies, as I've said, the issue we have is that treatment selection is influenced by subject characteristics, which means that can we trust any analysis that comes out of them? Because these characteristics can differ systematically between the treated and the untreated group because you have selection bias and so on. So what we can do, and what is traditionally done, is that you'll build yourself a regression model that factors in the things that you think. You'll account for the things that you think are confounders by including them into a big regression model. And that actually is effectively what a lot of the machine learning algorithms do, because they take into account, they're really complex models that actually build in the fact that you've got these differences that impact things. So you build these big models that give you the biggest predictive power. What I work on is something slightly different, and that's a bit more directed at robust causal methods. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So in randomized control trials, the great thing about them is that the treatments are assigned randomly, which means that the treated and untreated are exchangeable, which means that they're conditionally independent given the treatment status. And that means the conditional expectation of y, the thing we're trying to estimate, given d is the same as the expected value of y. That conditional expectation, the d doesn't have an impact on the thing you're trying to measure. So in that case, your treatment effect and the treatment effect of the treated coincide, they're the same thing. In observational studies, no such randomization exists. And in general, those expectations are different, as I've already demonstrated. So you may get bias, and that's problematic. So then there's the amazing work of Rubin, and then, over a 20-year period, there was some amazing papers coming out looking at propensity score. And that's where you try and calculate the probability of treatment assignment conditional on a whole load of characteristics. And it allows us to, I guess, mimic a randomized control trial using an observational study. So it's effectively a balancing score, and it allows you to go and do some maths. So I'm going to, this is just my setup of what the propensity score is, just the probability of being treated. Probability that D is 1, D is my indicator variable for treatment, given xi, which are a whole load of other things that you've measured about your population. And then conditional on this propensity score, the covariates will match, so you're able to do some analysis. Now, of course, we know what the propensity score is for randomized control studies because we have an experiment, right? We've randomized. So it's going to be, if you've got a complete randomization, probability of being treated is just half for an individual, for example, if you're treating half the population. But of course, for observational studies, we don't know what that is, and we have to estimate it. Now the problem with this all sounds wonderful in practice. Of course, we've got some real issues with this. Firstly, this assumes that there are no measured, to make this work, you have to assume that there are no unmeasured confounders. And that's a big block for this kind of thing. But of course, this is, again, why I think when you're looking at answering some of these questions, you have to really understand the context within which you're working. So if you're trying to answer a causal question, you have to really think about what actually might have an impact on this outcome so that you can also measure it as part of the study. But then that's quite difficult in practice, although it's becoming less difficult given all the data that we analyze, that we measure. So big condition that there are no unmeasured confounders, and that's the very first condition at the top. And there's a second condition. These two are called strong ignorability. The second condition is that your propensity can't be either 0 or 1. You imagine, because it's hard to measure things when they don't happen. So there are a whole load of things that we can do when we have the propensity score. What you can do is you can take your treated group and your control group, and then you can match them. So you can match individuals that have a similar propensity for treatment, and then you're able to work out the treatment effect. Lots of ways to do matching. But there are some issues with it. You can also stratify on propensity score, so then you can stratify your subjects and then measure your treatment effect using that method. Okay, first real maths of the evening. You can also you can also weight using the propensity score to obtain a new sample. And then if you work out the expected value of these things, you get back to the expected value that you're actually after. So it's an amazing thing, and I've done a lot of work using the propensity score, which is quite it's a lovely, lovely subject. Another thing that I've got into more recently is something called difference in difference, which is also very neat. And that's where you can, the maths for this is really lovely, but again, we've got assumptions. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I want to show you some analysis, but you can ask me afterwards how to do this if you like, because I want to whiz on to some data. But one of the things that if you assume that, or maybe I should just show you the model for the outcome. If you assume that your outcome looks like this, where you have a fixed effect for whether you're treated or not treated, and then you have a time effect, then you can actually use this difference in difference method to get at your treatment effect, which is basically if you assume that you just have a shift in outcome when you're treated to when you're not, then you can do some lovely maths and it all works out. So I want to come on to some data before I finish. So I was talking about air quality. So I did a study on the impact of low traffic neighborhoods, and everybody kicked off about low traffic neighborhoods because it meant that you basically get a ticket if you drive into certain parts of Islington during the day, which the drivers didn't like particularly. But we had a lot of really nice data on air quality, both within, on the edges of these zones, and then outside the zones, because we needed a control group to see if it actually had an impact on air quality. So we had data from 2019 to February 2021, and the low traffic neighborhood was introduced for summer of 2020. Anyone realize why this might be a difficult thing to analyze? Right bang in the middle of COVID, right? You think this is going to be a wonderful study, and then something comes and kind of messes it up for you. If you lock everybody down, then your data is a bit tricky to analyze. But nonetheless, we obviously at least we knew when lockdown happened, and we knew when people were not allowed to be driving and so on, so we were able to account for it. And not surprisingly, you reduce the number of cars in an area. Do you remember when, during COVID, I mean, it was hideous in loads of ways, but I do remember the air quality being so much better in London than it was, than it is again now. You know, I take my life into my hands with my cycle into work every day. So we demonstrated that there was a drop. However, it was much lower than the drop than if you just looked at the raw data, because of the fact that we did have those interventions like COVID coming along to reduce the traffic. But we did still see a significant drop. But the actual measured differences were vast. They were like close to 40%. But in fact, the actual drop was more like 9% in the NOx so measure of air quality. NOx is this really horrible thing that isn't very good for your lungs. So we were measuring that, and we saw some good reductions. Where are we? 5 minutes. So I've done all these other things that I'm not going to talk about. Oh, I will very, very briefly say another analysis that I really, oh God, it's going to sound terrible, I really enjoyed. I enjoyed in terms of being able to answer questions, but this was the one about child pedestrian casualties, and looking at, that's terrible, isn't it? Mainly because I'm trying to prevent them. I think we came to the conclusion, actually, that in South Kensington, clearly people have gardens, or maybe their children are on those reins until they're 18. I don't know if you live in South Kensington. But if you live in where I live, in Holloway, where the kids are feral, including my own, they're all out running around getting run over. But you can demonstrate that actually in those areas, because of things like less investment in roads and so on, you see an increase in child pedestrian accidents, and it's linked to deprivation. Not surprisingly, but I think that the more we raise awareness of these kind of things, then the more we can at least direct funding to areas that really need it, rather than south. And in fact, whenever we don't have it, with global warming, given that we're, storing all this data and charging it around, amongst other things, when I used to cycle into South Kent, whenever it was icy, I'd start in North London. I know it's central London, but the roads would be a nightmare, not salted and everything. I get to South Kensington, and there'd barely be it'd just be much nicer. Yes, so I want to finish, really, given that I'm about to run out of time, by saying that one of the things, I said I'd talk a little bit about kind of an academic career, and I think that one of the things that is really important is being able to take criticism. I remember the first time I submitted a paper when I was doing my PhD, and we got these brutal reviews back, and I remember thinking, I just don't want to do this. This is not for me. This is, and I think that actually, admittedly, some reviewers are just out to, but I think the majority are really, it's about doing good science. And so I think one of the things that I have become a bit thicker-skinned about is I now take it in good faith. Maybe it isn't necessarily always meant in good faith, but I think that unless we're actually criticizing and being willing to be criticized, then we also won't make progress. And we have the new freedom of, so this is me moving from Imperial. I would never have thought about these things when I was at Imperial, but moving to LSE, we have the new freedom of speech bill coming through into universities. And then we having to balance that with now at the moment, never offending anybody. And it's quite a tricky balance to make, because I think that we should all be open to being offended, because you'll meet people that just are very different to you and have very different ways of thinking to you. And we have to just assume that people are saying things in good faith. And then we have to educate people. So I think it shouldn't just be about free speech, it should also be about civil discourse. But I think that that's maybe more my LSE hat on now, rather than my mathematician's hat. So I think it's important to take some criticism, but I wanted to highlight the kind of thing. The Royal Statistical Society has some great journals, including and we have these red papers, so you go and read a paper and then people just kind of criticize it. But in 1986, there was a great paper by Harvey and Durbin, another great statisticians, that was looking at seatbelt legislation in the UK and how effective it had been, which of course it is. But Ehrenberg, who is an economist, wrote, can you believe this is actually published? You can see this if you go and read the journal. It says, this really is a dreadfully vapid paper, full only of intellectual masturbation. There you go. The danger is that younger statisticians often think such performance is sophisticated and ape them. Why did the authors not simply report that all their time series mumbo-jumbo made no difference? He was making the point that you could just look at the difference in the number of accidents. But of course you can't, because of things like confounding, as I've told you. So I think, and actually, they wrote a fantastic response. They said, it is difficult to respond to Professor Ehrenberg's tirade, since it contains little in the way of relevant rational argument. And in fact, this is what, whenever I reply to, I don't know, those of you that when you get those reviews and you think, oh my goodness, and then I'm always so polite. You're always like, thank you so much for your insightful comments. Actually, what I need to do is say, so it's difficult to respond to your irrational argument. That's what I'm going to do when I next get some bad reviews. But I think the point is, of all of this, is that, as they say in their last sentence, the fact that a simple before and after comparison sometimes gives the same result as a model which allows for a trend in exploratory variables and so on does not always mean it gives the same result. So I think coherent use of statistics and causal inference, causal methods, I think have a really important role to play in data science and AI. And I think it's a challenge for us at the moment, actually, with some of the models that are around and being used, because they just promote and promulgate. And I mean, AI is an amazing tool, and I'm very excited by AI, because I think it will allow us to accelerate and enhance, I think, human intent. But I think that we need to make sure that we keep in mind that it's human intent that we're trying to enhance and accelerate. And I think we also need to be very, very careful, because they are built on models of data that is necessarily historical, or at least up to now. And if things like recommender systems, if we use those on the data that's historical, we just, again, propagate all of the biases that are inherent in the data. And I think that we need to stop and think about what do we want our future to look like? And that might be very different from the data that we've collected up to now. So I will hope that we bring a little more of that kind of social science into some of the work that's being done on some of these large language models and machine learning techniques and so on. And with that, I will end, and thank you very much for your attention.